Welcome to New Thinking for a New World, a Tilburg Foundation podcast. I am Alan Stoga, your host. Each week, I bring you conversations with people who think differently about the great issues that are shaping our world. Geopolitics, disruptive tech, mass migration, the changing climate, culture wars, all of it is grist for our mill. I hope you enjoy listening. I also hope you will let me know what you think and that you join the conversation at tilburgfoundation.org. And now for today's episode of New Thinking for a New World.
Great art is timeless because it provides insights into our souls, into how we think and why we do what we do. That's as true of Shakespeare's sonnets as it is of Michelangelo's frescoes, as it is of the Greek tragedies. But what if those classics could be repurposed to shed light on the specific challenges of modern society, to help ordinary people probe the impact of racial discrimination, political corruption, war, or other scourges on their lives in the same raw and real ways that the original audiences of Shakespeare, Michelangelo, and the Greeks understood them? The results could be amazing, healing, entertaining, educational, allowing us to understand ourselves through the long lens of antiquity, partly by stripping away what we think is so special about our time, focusing instead on what makes us human. I'm not trying to wax poetic because I'm a lousy poet. Rather, I'm trying to describe the work of Theater of War Productions and Bryan Doerries, my guest today. Welcome, Bryan.
Thank you so much, Alan.
Let me do a quick setup. Theater of War Productions, which you co-founded and of which you are the artistic director, works with leading actors to present dramatic readings of seminal plays followed by town hall discussions. Those are sort of the key elements. I know it works because I've been privileged to be in a few of those audiences, but I'd like you to share the origin story. You're a classicist, but how did you connect the dots from 400 BC to real people and real issues in the 21st century?
Oh, thanks. That's a great question. So I started this journey studying Greek and Latin and Hebrew at Kenyon College in rural Ohio, and graduated with this hunch that I wanted to pursue these plays, these ancient Greek tragedies I studied further. But I didn't know how or when. And it wasn't until they spoke directly to me that I saw the path forward. And the way that happened was I lost someone I loved, a girlfriend who died of cystic fibrosis when she was 22 years old. I was her principal caregiver for about 5 months toward the end of her life. And I was 24, 25 at the time. And being a caregiver for someone who was terminally ill in my mid-20s brought me into direct contact with some of the extreme human experiences described in plays by Sophocles, Euripides, and Aeschylus. And all of a sudden, caring for someone I loved, not being able to stop her suffering, feeling complicit at times in her suffering, facing questions of life and death, and losing someone I loved, the place all of a sudden that I'd studied as a student in college were no longer academic. It was as if they were written like letters from the ancient world to me or for me or about me. And they brought me solace and relief to know that I wasn't the only person who'd felt, fill in the blank, this ashamed, this alone, this cut off from one's community, this isolated. And I got this hunch, this sort of desire and hunch that maybe if I put these ancient plays in front of other people who'd lived through these extreme human experiences that we all get the chance to experience at some point over the course of our lives, that they could bring relief and solace and hope and connection to those people as well. So that's how it all started. And the short version is I started directing readings of my own translations of ancient Greek plays in hospitals in New York City for doctors and patients and caregivers and nurses. And what I saw in those exchanges with those audiences in hospitals is that although I translated the plays from Greek and thought I was pretty clever in doing so, the audience with something at stake, the audience with skin in the game, the audience who'd lived these extreme human experiences knew more than I did about the play.
But they knew more about the play through their own experiences. They didn't know the play, they knew the experience.
They never heard of the play, but they knew more about the play than I did. And I say that not with hyperbole or exaggeration. That was the principal observation and lesson for me that started this journey, which is a question. What new things are possible when we approach audiences who may or may not be formally educated with reverence and humility for what they might know by virtue of their own life experiences that we don't know, that no amount of training or academic learning could ever afford or extend. And so that's what led me on this ecstatic journey from first to hospitals, then to the military bases, and from military bases to prisons, and prisons to homeless shelters. And the list goes on and on. Natural disasters, racialized police violence, domestic violence, gun violence, rival gang territories, you name it, in search of audiences with something at stake for whom the words of these ancient plays were not academic. And they weren't to be consumed either. They weren't cultural. They were direct. And the other thing I came to see and understand over this last 18 years is that sometimes formal education can be an impediment to the direct, efficacious experience of a story. So that's been the, so it's not so much for me what these plays can teach audiences. That was sort of how I started. It was sort of a didactic notion of how culture worked. It's become, and it was immediately in that hospital auditorium, what audiences with something at stake can reveal about these plays, but also about what it means to be human that hasn't changed over thousands of years.
So I'm trying to imagine how the first time you got in front of a group of Marine combat guys who are already experiencing the horrors of war and tried to persuade them to sit still for a little bit while they listened to a reading of whether it was Antigone or whatever play you wanted them to listen to. I suspect it required some officers saying, you're going to sit in these seats. But the first question is, how do you get them in the room? And then what happened in that room, whatever that first room was?
Well, part of the origin story of the work and the project Theater of War, which is our first project, really, and the namesake of the company, our military project, is that my girlfriend died on March 20th, 2003, which was the night we invaded Iraq. And I remember listening on the radio to the invasion and thinking, these two things are happening and they're not related, but in some deep level, they feel connected. I had protested in the streets against the invasion of Iraq and felt very ineffective in having done so. But when stories started to come back, and the main one was in the Washington Post in 2007, the Walter Reed scandal, when that broke, where our nation's flagship military medical facility was seen to be offering substandard care, black mold in the ceilings, leaking, faucets, just retrograde conditions for veterans returning from the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. I just felt like no matter how I felt about the invasion or our foreign policy decisions, I couldn't sit on my hands and watch the United States criminalize its own volunteer military class, or treat them the way that Vietnam veterans had been treated. And so all I had was Greek and Latin and these plays about the Trojan War that I had this hunch, having come out of these hospital readings that I was mentioning to you, might speak to military audiences because they described warriors struggling under the weight of their service to maintain their dignity and honor in really extreme conditions after losing friends and loved ones, after being betrayed by their own commanding officers. And I had this thought that maybe this hunch, this formless hunch, as the great director Peter Brook used to say, if I could put these ancient war plays in front of contemporary warriors, something would happen. I didn't know what it was. I didn't know a single person active duty in the military when I had this idea. And So to answer your question, it took a year and a half to get an audience of Marines to watch. And it took me sitting in a lot of smoke-filled rooms, drinking stale coffee, listening to veterans tell their stories for me to begin to even understand their language, which I didn't know how to speak. But that also informed my translation, because one of the questions I'm asking as a translator and a director is, for whom are we telling the story? And that informs all of the sort of artistic choices that are being made. This is a theater where the audience is the teacher, where the audience is the master, not the other way around. So anyway, the short version of that is that I through reading the New York Times, discovered there was a Navy psychiatrist named William P. Nash who was quoted in the New York Times in a story about violence returning to our shores from the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan in the form of veterans killing other people on our shores and also taking their own lives. Nash said, I begin every conversation I have about combat stress with Marines, with the ancient story of Sophocles' Ajax. And so I just wrote and speed dialed until I could get Nash. And 24 hours later, he said, I don't know about getting you onto a military base, but how about 400 Marines in a Hyatt ballroom in San Diego at a conference on combat stress? So the answer to your question is they were already going to be at this conference, and they had a choice between free tickets to a San Diego's Padres game that night at this conference or watching a Greek play and talking about their feelings. And I don't know, we had a government sort of per diem bar and sort of buffet in the back of the room. So there was like a meal included that was paid for the conference. And we had several actors that people might have known, David Strathairn and Jesse Eisenberg and an Iraqi-American actress named Heather Raffo and Bill Camp. And we didn't know what was going to happen, but I just wanted to clarify something about the level of attention I saw in the room. I don't think it was mandatory for them to be there because they could have been in a sporting event. And what I saw at that first military performance is something I'll never forget, which is here we are from New York performing in San Diego for an audience of Marines and their spouses. The Marines have just returned from war within weeks of this event. It's August of 2008. And it's seen as a career-ending gesture in the military to raise your hand and say, I'm struggling with an invisible wound. And we start performing these scenes from Sophocles' Ajax and Philoctetes, these two relatively obscure Greek plays about the Trojan War. And not only are they listening, but they're leaning forward in their seats. Some are wiping away tears. Some are like looking through their fingers. Some are holding their heads in their hands. And they are staring at the actors with a level of intention and attention and consciousness that I have never seen in the commercial or nonprofit theater, ever, before or since.
Which told you it worked.
Well, I didn't know if it was right. I didn't know what it was. Were they being polite? I didn't know anyone in this culture.
Marines aren't polite. Marines don't have a polite button.
After it was over, they gave us a standing ovation. I thought, that maybe they're just, glad that we're trying to do something for them, or, it's a night out or whatever. And we scheduled a 45-minute discussion after the performance. And I asked the question I often ask audiences, what resonated with you? And the discussion had to be cut off more than 3 hours later. And we heard from dozens and dozens of Marines from every rank. This is really important to me to convey, because what also happened that night, what I saw for the first time, is that a powerful performance of an emotionally charged text can briefly dissolve the hierarchy in the room. And if the currency in the conversation isn't power or money or education or access or privilege, but it's lived experience, well, then the Lance Corporal has as important a thing to offer, if not more, than the general. And we heard from the Lance Corporals and the command sergeant majors and the spouses and the, every rank, the captains and the majors and the generals' wives. And they quoted lines from memory from the play without notes, as if they'd known these ancient Greek plays their entire lives. And I couldn't figure, all I knew is I barely apprehended what was happening in the room. I could see something was happening. I could tell that I was privileged to be there to witness it. And yet I felt like maybe, I had disappeared. And that's the other thing I'll say about our work. If it really works, two things happen. One is it's a disappearing act. It's like we were never there. The community we've engaged all of a sudden starts talking about something they've never been able to discuss in accordance with their own values on their own terms. And we've just started the dance. Like it just happens. And the other thing is, and this is also back to what I've said earlier, I know it's working when the least powerful person in the room is speaking.
Well, let me pull on two threads. They're so important to what you do. one, you've talked about already, which is the discussion. This isn't about the performance or the it's about the discussion.
That's right.
And that's the genius of this whole approach. The other, though, is that you have both in that the situation you just described, but throughout the years, been able to attract world-class actors from the theater, from movies, from TV. And that degree of professionalism honors the audience.
That's right. I think it's validating.
It validates what you're doing. It gets people in the room, but it's even more than that. It makes it serious. How did you imagine you could get the Bill Camps and the Bill Murrays and the others to do this stuff?
Well, I didn't. At first, I didn't. At first, I was just it wasn't any old actor, but I was pulling in actors who were my friends, who were not at the top of the game necessarily, either in terms of their abilities or their fan. That wasn't how it started. In the first few readings I was mentioning, even before these hospital readings, as I was starting to get the idea. Then someone came to me to one of my readings and they said, "That was great. Let me give you a piece of advice. You should work with the best actors on the planet. You should not compromise on what you're doing in any way. So go for it. Go do that." So I didn't know how to go about doing that, but the first one was a cold call. I heard that David Strathairn, an actor who's, been with us for all 18 years, has done hundreds of events all over the world with us. I heard David's wife had worked with kids with autism and horses, and maybe had been a nurse at some point. And so I called the director I knew and said, "Could you give me David Strathairn's phone number?" And I cold called David on his cell phone. And I said, "I'm going to be doing these readings in hospitals. I understand your wife might have done this, this, or this. And I just thought maybe you might be interested in joining us." And of course he said yes. And then David did it, and he recommended Paul Giamatti, and Paul Giamatti did it, and he recommended his friend, and the list goes. Now we have over 250 actors, many of them Oscar, Tony, Emmy, BAFTA award-winning actors who all do this regularly. We don't work with agents or managers or just text. We don't contract them either, so they can pull out at the last minute. But then there's always the opportunity for someone just as great to step in and save the day. And it's become this community. And I'll say the short answer is, at first it was hard. Like, it was just the awkwardness of asking people. But then it became iterative, like you said earlier. And then I think the core reason why we have so many who are so dedicated, so many great actors. I mean, short of working, I don't think it seems short. Like, we're working with the Marlon Brandos and the Joanne Woodwards and the Paul Newmans of our day. We're working with the Sidney Poitiers. Like, these are the best actors on the planet as far as I'm concerned. And not just here. We work with great actors in the Netherlands. We work with amazing actors in London. We just came back from doing Theatre of War with Damian Lewis in London last week or a week and a half ago. People want to do this. And the reason they want to do it, I would argue, there are two, is that it's very rare in their profession to feel like they're doing something that's actually of service with their craft. Sometimes with their celebrity, they can do things that are of service. But to know that how I perform this line in Sophocles or Shakespeare or Ibsen or O'Neill could actually have the impact on the trajectory of a single human life. Someone who then raises their hand in the discussion and says, "I now see that I need help," or "I understand my parents for the first time because of the way you read that line," or whatever it is. And it's palpable and it's direct and it's in the room. And if you told me 19 years ago, that reading a play for an audience of people who have something at stake, who might be at risk in some way, could save lives, I'd say that sounds, self-congratulatory. It does still, but it's real.
But it's true.
So once the actors have a taste for doing something of service with their craft, I think, they don't give up working for Steven Spielberg, although some have actually passed on commercial work to do our projects because they report that it in some way works on them as well, that it's nutritious. It nurtures them. It gives them something that the business takes away. And that's how it works.
What do War Lessons from Gaza, Rethinking Education, Peace in Ukraine and Visionary Leadership have in common? They are all themes from recent episodes of this podcast. Check out more episodes on thalbergfoundation.org or on a platform of your choice.
I want to fast forward to Antigone and Ferguson. I had the privilege of watching a performance of it in Athens in 2017. And I know the backstory, but tell the story, because it is one of the most amazing things I've ever seen and consequential things I've ever experienced. How did you get the idea that after that horrible tragedy in 2014, that you could have a role to play in, not in solving, but in healing that community, which was obviously so badly rent?
Well, Antigone and Ferguson as a project, which happened for us in 2016, so it's a good 8 years after starting this work, was the first time for Theater of War Productions where we didn't just swoop into a community with professional actors and perform a text to then start a conversation, which has its own value and merits. We did something new, and that is we brought the community into the performance alongside our professional actors. We've been doing a lot of work in Missouri over the years, and leading up to that, we've done work in their prison system with our project Prometheus in Prison and the state prisons in Missouri. We've been in the Children's Hospital in St. Louis doing end-of-life care performances and work with parents and nurses. And we've done work at Fort Leonard Wood, the military base, and one of the bases in Missouri. So we've been in Missouri quite a bit. And we did a project in Joplin, Missouri, where we did readings of the book of Job on the 1-year anniversary of the tornado in Joplin that leveled the city, with Paul Giamatti playing Job in a mega church for 2,500 fundamentalist Christians. And so the governor at the time, Jay Nixon, came to that performance. Someone from the governor's office who'd seen our work, who attended a Black church in St. Louis, knew the power of our model, and then reading a story that was written about us in Harper's Magazine was kind of inspired to reach out and said, I don't know what it is you could do, but I think I have the connections here in the faith community to help you do something in response to the death of Michael Brown and to the uprising and to the polarization of this community. And that was it. The question of polarization. We don't ask people to agree in our model. We just ask people to stay in the room and hear each other's interpretations of a story. And that's an act of mediation that has created a tent big enough to include members of a squad, Letitia James, Jumaane Williams, very far left politician, and then Republican mayors who performed in our projects, members of the Republican National Committee and MAGA stronghold in Ohio, all in the same group, like the full spectrum, gang members alongside climate activists, alongside deeply conservative people. And the reason, again, is that we're not asking people to agree. We're just asking people to hear each other's interpretations of the story. So the idea of Antigone Ferguson is, could we create a Greek chorus that could not preach to itself by design and use that as a model for bringing people together in a way that would facilitate dialogue? So for that Greek chorus, we set about to find people who wouldn't necessarily agree or whose wounds were still very fresh with regard to the death of Michael Brown. Michael Brown's friends, his teachers, members of the community around Normandy High School, which he attended, faith community members, Black Lives Matter activists, and then I think most critically, law enforcement from St. Louis, police officers who'd responded to the uprising. And could we get them all in the same room, give them the lines of Sophocles' Antigone's, the chorus, the Theban elders, set it to music written by someone in St. Louis, and then see what would happen if we invited audiences that were as diverse as the chorus to come into the room and hear this music and hear these interpretations and join us in dialogue. And, so the brief version of that is, we premiered the project on the stage that Michael Brown graduated from at Normandy High School in 2016, that fall, 2 years after his death. And it took off. I mean, we traveled the country and the world. We took it to Greece, where you saw it, and back. For many of the chorus members, it was their first time out of the country. I was with Michael Brown's teacher, his drama teacher, when he stepped into the Theater of Dionysus in Greece for the first time, and how overwhelmed he was by being in that place. And we ran it off Broadway for 15 weeks here in New York City, in Harlem and Brooklyn, at a church that we, with the help of the Stavros Niarchos Foundation, commandeered for 10 weeks. And the project only iterated and grew. And now this model of the chorus that can't preach to itself by design has become standard in theater of war productions. It's one of our other strategies. It's one of the other layers of our work. So our most recent iteration of that was we were commissioned by Columbia University to develop a project to address the unrest on campus and bring people together and sit them at the table. And so we did readings from the Iliad and the Trojan Women with a chorus that included Palestinians, Israelis, IDF veterans, Lebanese Christians, protesters, you name it. And again, the objective wasn't to ask them to agree. It wasn't a group hug. We weren't going to resolve Middle Eastern war or conflicts, but we could create the conditions where people could maybe hear and acknowledge each other's tragedies by way of the mediation of an ancient story. And that's how Antiquity Ferguson continues to reverberate through our work. As we engage in more and more polarizing topics by using the model of the Greek chorus as the thing that can bring people together.
As you've described it, Theater of War Productions has very much evolved over these almost 2 decades. One of the things I've seen you do recently is tackle long-form journalism, which I find enormously fun, and using articles from The Atlantic and other sources, and have, again, great readers read them with enthusiasm and style and professionalism, and then open conversations about it. And that's been about the pandemic. It's been about all sorts of topics. And it is fascinating to watch models evolve. This one surprises me.
It surprised me too. It was my colleague, Marjolaine Goldsmith, who's our company manager. She's an actor in the company as well, and also designed all of our work on Zoom during the pandemic, which was a major iteration for us. Our first event on Zoom was for 15,000 people from 42 countries on May 7th, 2020, with Oscar Isaac and Frances McDormand performing Oedipus the King. And it was a whole new ballgame for us because of Marjolaine's innovations, that we could bring people into dialogue across borders and boundaries without the intervention of corporations or countries or advertisers, and have pluralistic exchanges. And that hasn't stopped for us. Our work is hybrid. It's ecstatic. We have hyper-local conversations in the oldest Black church in America, or the football stadium, the University of Notre Dame on the field, or a bar in Toronto, that are hyper-local and also global in scope, people participating all over the world. But Marjolaine turned to me and said, we kept talking about how most audio renderings of long-form journalism, and I would even argue audiobooks too, for the most part, either sound like AI or are AI. And I still don't fully understand why that is. Partly on the journalism side, I think it has to do with the sort of false notion that the dispassion of the reporter or the writer has to extend to the actor who's reading the piece. And what it does is it sort of negates the role the actor can play. The other thing is that I think we've become numb, inured, cut off from how we should be feeling about the news we consume every day. And it has something to do with the one-way direction of the media through which we consume it. It's great that we've democratized these media in some ways. It's also problematic, but we have access to information. It's just that we don't have access to forms where we can exchange our feelings, our ideas, our interpretations of that information very readily, except in these very flattened manners like Twitter and, TikTok. And so one of the things that we're interested in is, can we build a social medium that's capacious enough to hold the emotions and the ethics that are required of us in discourse about what's happening in the news? So we thought we'd partner with a radio station. And this is one experiment at WNYC. We went to WNYC in New York City, the largest NPR affiliate. And we said, we'd like to do readings of long form journalism. We got a grant from the Laurie M. Tisch Illumination Fund and their Arts and Health Initiative. So the focus of these first 6 episodes is public health, very largely and broadly defined. And we partner with the New Yorker, the Atlantic, and ProPublica, and we brought to bear our amazing actors. And by brought to bear, I mean, I really think there's a role for actors to play in helping us reawaken our emotions, whether we're talking about Sophocles or we're talking about the Atlantic. And it's not every line, because there's lots of reporting, for instance, in the Atlantic that's just data. But for example, our first performance in the series as an experiment was about the death of Jordan Neely, the individual experiencing homelessness on the F train who was killed by a Marine named Daniel Penny last year, who was recently acquitted. And the actor Chad Coleman was reading the lines of Jordan Neely. And what Jordan Neely said as he entered the F train was, "I need food." Well, as I'm reading, "I need food," it doesn't hit me in the gut. It impacts me, but it's not. But hearing Chad Coleman bring a kind of emotional valence, a kind of desperation to the reading of those 3 words, well, it changes the dynamics. And then the other thing is of how I'm receiving those words, but also in the company of others. What I like about radio and also about Zoom is the simultaneity of broadcasts, the idea that we're all watching and listening at the same time. What I really like about what we've done with Zoom, and thanks to Marjolaine, is that we can actually be in dialogue with each other. It's not a one-way stream. And radio is sort of the last vestiges of a broadcast medium with call-in, where the simultaneity of attention, of consciousness that can be generated when people are listening to a story and then calling into your show heightens the experience for all that are involved. So this has been an experiment for us. I was worried in the beginning. We were worried. One of our principal strategies is, I think Alan, has been distance. We do classical plays. We do texts from history. We're not saying to the audience, "This is you." We're asking the audience to reflect. Well, what do you see of yourself in this distant thing, this culturally or temporally distant thing? Sometimes the greater the distance, the deeper the conversation goes, because people don't feel accused of anything. What if, by doing long form journalism, it felt too close to the bone, or too much like documentary theater, which is so rife with so many ethical issues. I never really wanted to touch that form of theater. It turns out the other leg of the table that's so critical to our projects working, as we've discovered in this series, is having audiences curated with something deeply at stake. So by performing long-form journalism, not just for the general public, although we pick topics that affect everyone: mental health, the pandemic, Ozempic, most recently, ghost networks and insurers, fatherhood, having audiences that, have, our last one was about domestic violence and gun violence and the intersection of the two in a rural county and 2 rural counties in Tennessee. Having people in the audience who had a direct experience with domestic and gun violence be part of the audience response in the audience itself undergirds the exchange, so that I think it still works. I hope it still works. We're about to do our 5th episode or installment. But it's really exciting new territory for us. And for, I think, scale for this project is doing one a week. Right now we're doing one a month. I think scale for this would be a nationally syndicated show where we're able to bring to bear these hundreds of actors, bring them into the fold and have them perform long-form journalism and have national discussions, global discussions about the news. Sometimes I hope as it's unfolding, so we could be performing stories just as they drop or break. And that would be, I think, another act of mediation, like mediating the media, creating a space where people can actually communalize their own emotions and discomfort and challenges in response to what the news is bombarding us with every day. And can we pick topics? This is one of the challenges that don't divide us further and then present them in a way where we'll hear from conservative as well as liberal communities. And that's the other thing we've been trying to do. And it's exciting because I guess the one thing I've seen over the last 18 years that I've come to take as an article of faith is that there's so much that divides us in our country right now. And this, I know, speaks to Talberg's mission and polarization. There's so much that divides us. And it's counterintuitive. But I think if we're able to tap into suffering that unites us, the things that we all experience that are actually painful, and create spaces where we can communalize that suffering, a lot of those differences, at least temporarily, can fall away and we can have an exchange. And that's what we're seeing with this series, with the long-form journalism.
One of the things I love about this initiative is that it really is an effort, maybe not consciously, to redefine journalism. So much of what's happened in the 21st century has been the diminution of journalism, down to 160 characters or 250 characters, social media, TikTok, you mentioned. So long form still exists, but it's mostly ignored and some of it's really bad. And what I think you're actually doing is trying to take it and say, oh, this is really important stuff, but it needs to be done differently in order to reach people who probably aren't reading The Atlantic regularly. I suspect almost no one in your audiences are subscribers.
Yeah, on one hand, it's about exposing more people to this form and engaging them with it. And it definitely...
But it's also about changing the form.
It's about changing the form. I don't see what we're doing as journalism, but we have the writers in the room with us in the rehearsal process, which has been really exciting because when we reach ethical questions like, do we go for verisimilitude here, or do we make another choice in performance of this text? Or, was this said with emotion or removed? Or, but at the end of the day, this is a performance to provoke a discussion that uses journalism as the catalyst. It's not journalism itself, but I do think it has the potential to further democratize the form. And I think one of the ways is, and this, may or may not be appealing, but I think one of the things that's been really effective about our model over the last 18 years is that although we use text that people, no one's going to understand Sophocles, well, the reason people understand Sophocles is both because they've lived the experiences in Sophocles' plays, that we, intentionally going for those audiences, but it's also because we've decentered the written word as the catalyst for the discussion. It's about the affective experience of hearing the story performed. And if it's not about your ability to read or your interest or capacity to, whether it's read Sophocles or The Atlantic, but more just about the affective experience we can all have listening to a story performed in real time in front of us, well, then it democratizes the possibility of response and exchange. And there are people exploring, I've talked to companies who are exploring the idea of long-form journalism existing only as audio in some instances, not as written text. And I think there's something compelling about that. I mean, obviously, I'm a voracious reader of all these magazines, and I was Sophocles, and I'm an evangelist for the text. But I also think sometimes these cultural models that are sort of constructed for a very specific audience, whether we're talking about theater or we're talking about long-form journalism, in some ways are built to keep other audiences out just by nature of how they're constructed. And there are ways we can democratize them. And it's not just about the didacticism of extending long-form journalism to audiences that don't know about them. It's also about the power of, our last episode where we had, people who'd done 30 years in prison talking about going back into the communities that they had harmed with gun violence and trying to change not just themselves, but the communities that they lived in. They'd never heard of ProPublica necessarily, but they illuminated something in the ProPublica article we read that was as essential as the article. And so creating media that are not one-way streams, but that move in multiple directions, I think changes the nature of journalism. It's already happening with these other media like TikTok and these other social media. You know, there's this sort of meta commentary that's constantly occurring, but those mediums, as powerful as they are, I would argue, aren't capacious enough to hold the emotions and the complexity of the kind of exchange that we should be having. And that's why when I talk about Zoom, people look at me sideways because they're like, Zoom is where I go to have banal conversations with my family about things I wish I weren't talking about. Zoom is like this corporate communications tool that, you know, it should be avoided, especially after the pandemic. But for me, Zoom and other media like Zoom intimate and suggest a medium that's yet to be born that could meet the needs of this deeply polarized, still fledgling, pluralistic, multiracial, multicultural democracy that's still trying to figure out if it's going to work or not, and desperately needs forms that can hold the emotions and the ethics in one space.
Bryan, I've known you and your work for some time, and as you know, have been a great fan, even to the point that I try to steal some of your ideas. Thank you. But I've often wondered why more people aren't doing the voodoo you do. And the answer I've just realized as we've had this conversation is because you're damn good. You really have built something that is working, and it's working at a level that is in the true meaning of the word, fantastic. So thank you for this conversation.
Thanks, Alan. I appreciate it. That's really nice of you to say. I wish that I don't think that what we're doing is rocket science.
It's fantastic. I didn't say it was rocket science.
But, you know, I think it's fantastic too, but I think anyone can do it. I don't mean to be glib about that. I just think it's a value proposition. Do you believe there's wisdom in the audience? Full stop. If you believe there's wisdom in every audience, then why are we turning off the lights and relegating it to silence every time? Or trying to legislate how it speaks and when? Or policing it when it enters a room? And these are the questions I leave you with, because if we truly believe there's wisdom in the audience, and I do, then we have to dismantle all of these structures we built to keep the audience silent, including, I would say, the basis of like naturalism in the theater itself and our cinematic spaces, the turning off of the lights, which happened sometime in the mid-19th century, from which we've yet to sort of awaken. What the Greeks knew, and I'll stop here, is that, you know, there had to be a place where we could see in both directions. And that's what amphitheater means in Greek, amphitheatron, the place where I see in both directions, where I see you and you see me and we see each other and we see ourselves reflected in stories. And we see that we're playing roles. And maybe we step back from the roles and we engage in a more direct and human way. And I don't think we get there until we turn on the lights and invite people to be themselves.
And on that note, thank you very much.
Thanks, Alan.
Thank you for listening to this episode of New Thinking for a New World. I'm Alan Stoga, podcast host, and I look forward to your joining our next conversation. Remember, tell us what you think at telbergfoundation.org.